Can a Christian be a libertarian? David Bentley Hart would say absolutely not. Let me give you a taste of what David Hart says. That among the cultural concomitants of late modern capitalism are a morally corrosive materialism, a libertarian individualism inimical to Christian virtue, and a consumerist ethos of interminable acquisition and waste that is not only spiritually debilitating but also, from any vantage informed by the teachings of Christ, morally execrable? And this is a question he asks: can anybody deny this? And this is in an article in First Things regarding the present Pope. Other things he says regarding libertarianism. At the end of the article, speaking of the peculiarity of American conservatism, what other country could produce persons, for instance, who believe it is possible to be both Christian and libertarian? Okay, so that's the opinion of David Bentley Hart. Is he being reasonable or not? Well, the question as to whether or not there can be such a thing as Christian libertarianism actually depends a lot on what one means by libertarianism. In fact, if we divide libertarianism up into a purist form, if you like a theoretic and philosophical form, one might even say a dogmatic form, and a more pragmatic form, then one can find that the answer to the question ends up being either no or yes, depending on which connotation of libertarianism we are considering. So we have here from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy the following in its article on libertarianism. Libertarianism can be understood as a basic moral principle or as a derivative one. And then they go on to speak mainly about libertarianism as a basic natural rights doctrine in the spirit of Locke and Nozick. Now, it then goes on to talk about instrumental derivations such as those on the basis of rule consequentialism or teleology. And when we're talking about consequentialism, we're talking about a philosophy which judges everything morally by its practical consequences. But we might just call this a pragmatic approach. And it then goes on to talk about other subcategories of libertarianism. But then at the end it says this entry will simply address the plausibility of libertarian principles in their own right. And the fundamental principle of that kind of libertarianism, purist if you like, theoretical and philosophical, is this concept of self-ownership. Self-ownership as being one of the fundamental moral principles, that we do indeed own ourselves, and we therefore have deep rights concerning what can be done with us and to us. We have very strong rights of autonomy, and these rights fundamentally consist of a right not to be interfered with in following our own happiness, unless following our own happiness, our particular method of doing it, interferes with somebody else's right, somebody else's autonomy. Alright, well, there are two problems from a Christian perspective, and I think from just a basic rational perspective, with this assumption of self-ownership and maximalist autonomy. The first one is that although most people would say that this is an obvious thing, that most libertarians and many others would say, well, yes, you have this right to autonomy, you own yourself, you belong to yourself, surely that's obvious. Well, it's not really. It's not intuitively obvious once you engage in any kind of reflection. Not one of us, not one individual person in the universe earned their right to exist or caused themselves. Our existence is entirely out of our own power. None of us earned or caused ourselves. Most of our physical construction, our bodies, their development was dependent upon parents. So we can't even say we own our bodies. It's not obvious that we own our bodies, because indeed our bodies are not the result, to a large extent, of our own efforts. Now, there's another problem with this apparently obvious concept of self-ownership, and that is there's an illusion of self-evidence due to an equivocation between the word yours, meaning belonging to you by ownership, with the right to do with as you will, and the word yours as meaning belonging to you by being part of you. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, the libertarian would say this: you belong to yourself. The very fact that you are yours is obvious, it's self-evident, and therefore you have control and ownership over yourself and the right to do with yourself as you please, as long as it doesn't interfere with anybody else. Alright, well, here's where the illusion comes in. Now, when we say your body, yourself, is yours, as in having the right of ownership and complete autonomy, and nobody may interfere with the way you use yourself, for example, or what you do with your own body or soul, then we're using the word yours as meaning belonging to you by ownership, and with, because of ownership, a complete right to do with as you please. But when we say your body is yours, yours can take on a completely different meaning, belonging to you by simply being a part of you. Now, these two meanings are in fact distinct. So, for example, by comparison, a person's tendency to rage is something that belongs to them, yours. So if you have this tendency, this unfortunate tendency to fly into a rage, that is your tendency, that is yours. It belongs to you by being a part of you. But is it yours in the sense of being owned by you with a right to do with it as you will? Do you have a perfect right, because that rage belongs to you, is part of you, that is, to do anything you like with that rage? Well, clearly not. Just because the rage belongs to you in the sense that it is yours by being a part of you does not mean that it's yours to do with as you will, belonging to you by ownership, and with the concept of complete autonomy in the use of it. So a person's tendency to rage can be yours in one sense, but not yours with complete autonomy and control and rights in the other sense. If we look at the relationship of a bike's wheel to the bike, let's take a physical analogy. The bike's wheel belongs to the bike. We can say that the bike's wheel belongs to the bike because it's part of it. But we don't say that the bike's wheel belongs to the bike in the sense that the bike has rights over the wheel. That would be ridiculous. The bike has no conscious rights over itself at all, not being a conscious being. And so the word yours can mean more than one thing, in the same way the word belongs can mean more than one thing. So yes, you belong to yourself in the sense that you are part of you, you are yourself, so there's that meaning, you are yours in that sense. But that's not the same, not automatically and obviously and undeniably equivalent to saying that you are yours in the sense of ownership and complete autonomous right to do with as you please. So, given that the apparent self-evident nature of libertarianism is not that apparent on critical reflection, then we are falling back on our first objection, which is that in fact we didn't earn ourselves, we didn't cause ourselves, whether our minds or our bodies. We are largely dependent, certainly completely dependent for our existence, and largely dependent upon parents and the rest of society in terms of what we become, bodily and mentally. And so it's not clear, given that how much parents and wider society are invested in our very existence and essence, it's not clear that we therefore have some right to complete autonomy, that we have complete rights over ourself. There is a sense in which it seems obvious, in fact, that society and our parents, the rest of the community, has certain rights to us and over us. And this is something that is, whilst it's an execrable thing, a thing that will offend most modern people, it's hard to deny once we think about the very principles of our existence, how we came to be. Alright, so if we say that this form of libertarianism is by no means self-evident and in fact on reflection seems to be implausible, then what form of libertarianism might be more plausible? If this absolute concept of autonomy, of self-ownership is not plausible, what is? Well, there are two kinds of libertarianism. There's the philosophical, the dogmatic, that I've just been discussing, and there's a pragmatic form, which was hinted at in that section from the encyclopedia I quoted before. The pragmatic form of libertarianism makes a prudential, practical claim that does not deny mutual obligations beyond do no harm. In fact, it can affirm that we have mutual obligations to each other beyond the principle do no harm. It can admit a whole range of moral rights and responsibilities between people that go beyond mere self-ownership and autonomy, but it does deny that the government should delegate all or most of these responsibilities to itself. Instead, it says that most of these responsibilities, going beyond merely do no harm and autonomy, most of these responsibilities should be left to persuasion by subsidiary authorities and institutions such as families and churches. In other words, it claims that in many areas presently subject to governmental authority and interference, state mandates and administrative actions backed by physical force are less competent, less humane, and more liable to abuse and negative unintended consequences than the traditional alternatives. In other words, it doesn't say that we have this absolute right of autonomy, but it does say that in terms of what limits our autonomy, limits our any concept of self-ownership, it is not the government, fundamentally the government, that should act by force to protect all the other aspects of, if you like, our moral superstructure, the moral superstructure of communities and individuals. What it says is that the defence of libertarianism depends not on some purist dogma of self-ownership, but on the observable fact that when the government tries to enforce all these other kinds of moral obligations and responsibilities and rights above the principles of do no harm to others, then it tends to become tyrannical, it tends to become inefficient, and in general it often creates bigger problems than it's trying to solve. Now, this form of libertarianism does not depend on some absolute self-ownership principle, one which would be contrary to reason and also contrary to the Christian faith. What it does rely on is an empirical observation made by many that when governments go beyond a certain limited role of defending people's rights to liberty and rights to property and so on, that it tends to, by the act of force or by the threat of force, form a tyrannical solution that is actually worse than the problem it's trying to solve. Now, I would claim that this form of libertarianism, which is actually probably the most common form amongst Christians and many conservatives, is plausible but debatable, because in the end it depends upon, largely upon, an empirical observation, which, when it comes to social matters, is often a matter of conflicting interpretations. So, when we look at, say, the purest form of libertarianism, which is objectivism, that of Ayn Rand, or Ayn Rand I should say, then it says that there is no greater moral goal than achieving happiness, and it makes the individual the fundamental and, in a sense, the only morally significant agent. She said that her philosophy in essence was the concept of man as heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life. with productive achievement as his noblest activity and reason as his only absolute. And this particular idea leads to an advocacy of the most unregulated form of capitalism. And the idea that all government is there to do is to, with a strictly limited government, protect each person's rights to life, liberty and property. And that's it. So that form of libertarianism, given that it's based on this absolute principle of self-ownership, is one that I think Christians cannot hold, not only because of the rational critique I went through earlier, but also because in the scriptures we find it very clear that in fact people have not only rights to life, liberty and property, which I think you can defend from the scriptures, but they have deep responsibilities which will often qualify those rights to life, liberty and property. The scriptures make it quite clear that not just out of mercy, but out of justice, we have obligations to those around us, not just to do no harm to them or to not interfere with them, but to actively help them when they need our help. This is very clear from the Christian scriptures and really needs no defence in terms of theology. Now I'll finish by noting that even the more pure form of libertarianism is not entirely in conflict with Catholic teaching. And in fact, I recommend this article to any who would like to read more about this historic relationship between Lockean libertarianism and Catholic social teaching. It's an excellent article by Joe Hargrave, which notes not only the historic association, in that some of the people who drafted one of the great documents of Catholic social teaching were readers of and influenced by John Locke, but it also notes that many of the places where John Locke and the Church are meant to be in great conflict, these apparent disagreements actually dissolve when you actually bother to read what both the social teaching of the Church and Locke actually said. So this is an article definitely worth one's close attention, and it shows that Locke was not quite as absolute in his libertarianism, or classical liberalism if you prefer, as people think. Alright, so whilst I believe David Bentley Hart is right if he's referring to a purist, philosophical, dogmatic libertarianism, I think he's actually quite wrong when it comes to the more pragmatic, limited libertarianism that is actually most common amongst Christians and conservatives in the West. Whether they're right or not is another matter. One could argue about just how much the evidence indicates that the government's increasing role has actually been counterproductive. That's a matter for debate, which is a matter for empirical observation. But there can be no doubt that it is permitted to be this kind of pragmatic libertarian within the broad field of Catholic social teaching, where various principles are given, but the actual detailed application is left for debate. And that's all I have to say about the possibility of Christian libertarianism at this point.